Look at that, and everybody's sitting quietly. Perfect, well done. Thank you, good evening, and welcome to the London Library. It's so great to have you with us, both you in person and you online. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Daniel Gorman, and I'm the Director of English PEN, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to tonight's PEN Ackerley Prize award ceremony. English PEN obviously is a partner on the wonderful PEN Ackerley Prize. I just want to take a very small moment to tell you a bit more about English PEN before the prize ceremony begins. English PEN is one of the world's oldest human rights organizations. We were founded in 1921, and we champion the freedom to write and the freedom to read. We are a founding centre of PEN International, which is a worldwide worldwide organization with 145 centres in more than 100 countries. And we work to protect freedom of expression whenever it is under attack. We support writers facing persecution around the world. And we celebrate contemporary international writing with literary prizes, grants, events, and an online magazine, PEN Transmissions. We have a program running at the moment called PEN Writes, which is an international letter writing campaign in solidarity with writers in prison and at risk around the world. For decades, PEN has worked with writers who are unjustly persecuted, harassed, and imprisoned for exercising their right to freedom of expression. And PEN members have long supported these writers by sending them letters and messages of hope. And I'm delighted that this evening we have a stall at the back of the room with postcards, which we will be sending to writers at risk. So please do pay a visit over there and find out more about the campaign. The stand is just over next to the bar. So we're really thrilled that tonight's event is taking place in the London Library. It's such a wonderful venue, and it's great to be here again. And the London Library, we're also thrilled, are a Silver PEN partner of English PEN, and we're very, very grateful to them for their ongoing support. So that's enough from me. I'm really delighted to now hand over to Peter Parker, who's the chair of the judges and trustee of the J.R. Ackerley Memorial Trust, to tell us more about the prize and this year's shortlisted books. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. We're getting some feedback.
Just slight feedback. How's that? Step away from each other.
From the audience, perhaps, at this point. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. I'm just going to say a few words about the prize. I'm going to talk about the history of the prize because this is our 40th anniversary towards the end. But first of all, I just want to welcome you here. And we're delighted to be doing a live event after a 2-year hiatus of me talking to our shortlisted authors online, which is never easy or ideal. So welcome to you all. Thank you for coming out on this sultry day. Having said we're pleased not to do it online, we are live streaming it, so welcome to the people who are joining us remotely as well. The event is in partnership, as you've just heard, with English PEN, the London Library and the Arts Council England. We're in, for those who don't know the London Library, we're in the London Library Reading Room, which is one of the many atmospheric spaces in this large and almost impossible to find your way around building. I say this as a former trustee. It houses over 1 million books on 17 miles of shelves, so you're only seeing a tiny portion of it at the moment. The membership of the library is open to anyone, and the institution has been host to a wide community of writers, thinkers and readers since its foundation in 1841. It has many illustrious former members, almost as illustrious, I may say, as former winners of the PEN Ackerley Prize. They include Charles Dickens, Virginia Woolf, Christabel Pankhurst, Stanley Kubrick, as well as many autobiographers and memoirists, not least J.R. Ackerley himself. Tonight is part of a busy programme of events hosted by the London Library, and all information about these is on the London Library website. Now, as many of you will know, the PEN Ackerley Prize is named in honour of the author and long-serving literary editor of The Listener, J.R. Ackerley, and it is for literary biography or memoir by a British author. It was first awarded in 1942, 1982. I'm getting confused between the London Library. There are times when I feel I've been judging this prize since 1842, it has to be said. It remains the only British prize, literary prize specifically for autobiography and memoir. The judges are the trustees of the J.R. Ackerley Memorial Prize Trust, who are all themselves writers, and they are the novelist and short story writer Georgina Hammack, the biographer and critic Claire Harmon, the writer and editor Michael Keynes, and myself, who amongst other things is Ackerley's biographer and literary executor. The judges, thankfully, do not accept submissions from publishers, but they nominate the books to call in themselves. And this year we called in 34 autobiographies and memoirs published in 2021. Over a period of about 6 months or so, we sorted through these and we whittled them down to 8 possible contenders for the prize. Then during a meeting, this will sound familiar, on a very hot day in June, we produced this shortlist of 3 books. The books are in alphabetical order by author's surname. Arifa Akbar's Consumed, A Sister's Story, published by Scepter. Frances Stonor Saunders' The Suitcase, 6 Attempts to Cross a Border, published by Jonathan Cape. And Roy Watkins' Simple Annals, A Memoir of Early Childhood, published by CB Editions. These are 3 extremely fine books, to some extent all about family relationships, but their approach to the autobiographical form is very different, and this is something I hope to explore with the authors during our discussion. They've each chosen a short passage which they will read from their books to give you a flavour of them, after which I'll ask them individual questions and then we'll open up to a more general discussion. There will be time at the end for questions from the audience. If you're watching online this evening, you can ask questions at any point you like throughout the event using the chat function in YouTube. If you're in the room, if you want to ask a question, could you please wait till you're given a microphone? This means that whatever you ask will be picked up on the live stream. So I'd like to invite our shortlisted authors to come on stage, as you like. Frances Stonor Saunders, Arifa Akbar, and Roy Watkins. We're doing everything alphabetically, so I'm going to ask Arifa to read first of all, if that's all right.
Yes, of course. Hello, I hope everybody can hear me okay. And just a very quick prelude, I took a series of, my sister died in 2016. I decided to write about her life and death and our life as sisters. I took a series of trips in search of her in a way. She went to Rome at the age of 19. She was a bit depressed and she went, oddly, with a bunch of Catholics to see the Pope. She hated religious orthodoxies. I have no memory of why she chose to go and visit the Pope that Easter. And as she came back, revived, because she'd seen this beautiful art, she'd seen this Renaissance art, she'd been to the Sistine Chapel, and it transformed her for a while. And it didn't last long. She fell back into depression and various other things, but for a while it seemed miraculous. And I wanted to go and take a trip to the Sistine Chapel to see what she saw so many years on. And so here I am, you know, in the Vatican. I've been told to run because it gets very packed out in the Sistine Chapel, and this is what I'm doing.
Arifa, just before we go on, I think the microphone either needs turning up or just you need to hold it slightly closer.
Okay, so
That's
hopefully
great.
this is
right?
better. Yeah.
Thank you.
I break into a light run. I jog past a haze of religious paintings. I see flashes of gilt floating cherubs, Madonnas and Pietas. From an open window, I glimpse a view of the topiary in the Vatican's garden. I want to slow down and take in these things, but I know I have no time. I keep turning corners and wonder if I've gone down the wrong staircase and missed it, until I'm suddenly standing at the mouth of the chapel. I walk in and stand at its centre, wanting to look everywhere at once. I think of Fauzia, who's my sister. I think of Fauzia gazing at these walls, and I am her eyes and my own. We are sisters here in mutual awe. I look up and see the creation of Adam above me, and I see Fauzia smiling at its glory. Sitting in this chapel, I can't begrudge Rome its beauty, and in it, a sense of the divine. The longer I look, the brighter the paint gleams. Figures constantly emerge from the sea of humanity on the walls. A woman in a green dress on the central altar wall that I didn't see in the first hour. A man balancing a pillar on his back. Another with his head in his hands. A serpent wound round the legs of a man. Sky, clouds, death, life, love and ecstasy. There's a collision of worlds, human and phantom, God and the devil, the seen and unseen, now and eternity. Occasionally, a priest steps to the front of the chapel to hush the crowd and remind us that this is a place of contemplation. Worlds without end, he says quizzically, which gives me strange comfort. After 2.5 hours away, after 2.5 hours, I wrench myself away. If I ever need to feel close to Fauzia, I will come back here. And it was a transformative trip, because until then I was very despairing and quite angry at her death. So, that's it from me.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the authors questions after they've done the reading, so we're not just sitting here doing one reading after another. So it's very interesting that the Sistine Chapel was so important, given that you're both from a Muslim family. And you go on, and you were in Rome also, and you went to see Keats's grave, and Keats, like your sister, died of tuberculosis. Would you like to talk a bit about what you think it was your sister saw that you could connect with? You talk about life, death, love on this ceiling.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, my sister was an artist, and she was a natural-born artist, and we were incredibly close as sisters. We came from quite a complicated family. We were positioned in very specific ways within this family, but what was very clear in the family is that she was a very talented young artist, and we grew up knowing that. She grew up with a real love of art, and when she became a teenager, she got into a very prestigious college in London, St Martin's, Central St Martin's now, which she dropped out of because she had so little confidence, and an eating disorder and depression took grip. But the love of art never died. It did paralyze her and took out large parts of her life. She really developed this fascination with Renaissance art, which, as I say, was actually quite puzzling to me. She hated, any religious orthodoxies. And when I think about what I think it could have been is, and I got these clues from this enormous cache of artwork that she left behind, because after dropping out of St. Martin's, she actually didn't continue the art practice or the training for decades, and it was only in her early 40s that she sort of summoned the courage to go back to art. And she was at Camberwell College when she started feeling, really very ill, but she was in a sort of frenzy of productivity. She was painting, and she'd taken to embroidery and doing so much work. And when she died, and we were left with this enormous portfolio that sort of seemed to come out of every nook and cranny and crevice of her little flat, I saw, family on these pages, and the Madonna drawn and painted and sewn over and over again. And there were parallels that formed where there was that family, the Christian family, and then sometimes on parallel pages there was the family, her family, and she was working out the drama of families through this. And I think that may have been partly what she saw at the Sistine Chapel, but she also saw, a great amount of beauty. And as you say, I was in Rome to really investigate tuberculosis and the mythologies and around it. I
want to ask you a bit about that in a minute. Your title, Consumed, consumption was, of course, an old term for tuberculosis, and also you both suffered from binge eating, so consumption of one sort or another, almost opposite, are part of this. I mean, as you can imagine, judging this prize, we get in a great many autobiographies and memoirs that deal with illness, either of the author or a family member, or the death of a sibling and a parent or a child. These are the things that often prompt people to write memoirs. One of the things that marked out your book as very different from many of the books we get in is the way in which you sort of effortlessly expand from this central tragic story into a consideration of tuberculosis and indeed sisterly relationships in history, in art, in literature and opera. Could you say something about your decision to do this, to open out in this way?
Yeah, so first of all, I was, when my sister died, it was a mysterious illness. She was in a leading London hospital, North London hospital. They couldn't find what was wrong with her. She had a massive brain hemorrhage, and only afterwards they realised that they hadn't thought of TB. And I was, thunderstruck because I thought very naively tuberculosis was an illness that was in the past, and I found the facts were very different when I started looking. I didn't then think, one of my first thoughts weren't, well, I'm a journalist, so I'll write about this. I had no great desire to write about, death or grief or the death of a sibling or illness, actually. I'd worked as a literary editor, I'm a journalist, and I'd read a lot of, pretty amazing memoirs that mine grief and all those things that you've mentioned very beautifully, and I certainly didn't feel eloquent enough to do so. One of the motivators was that my sister had suffered, had been part of a system that she felt had silenced her, never understood her. She'd been depressed, she'd had eating disorders, she'd been part of so many systems that felt that she was, unreliable, not to be trusted, and so there was a lot of silencing around her. One of the motivators was to really write about, make her present and visible in the world once she had died. But really, I didn't want to just write a straightforward memoir. A friend sent me to a literary agent, and we sat down, and I said, I don't want to just write about death, and I think that's quite grim, and I don't have enough eloquence or enough to say. And together, we sort of expanded it to something. I'm also, trained as a news reporter and trained not to write about myself, the indulgence of that. And I really fought against. I found it very difficult to write in the first person, full stop. And so we thought that this was a way to reflect on and understand what had happened with my sister and within the family in that very focused, granular way. But also to understand things in a far larger way, siblings and the literature around siblinghood and sibling relationships in literature and art and all the rest of it that we can all connect with. So we all, a lot of us have those spiky or difficult, complicated, but very loving relationships. And the romance and mythologies around illness, but TB in particular, I just didn't realize how big a thing it was. And the science around it, the more I probed in various directions, the wider it got as a project. And what I liked about it was not that I was writing about what I knew. This is what we know, what happens. We know what our own versions of family and who did what to whom. And that was the thing that you'd have to rake up for a book like this, which was actually the most dreadful part of it. But what was really exciting were the discoveries. So going to, remembering things such as I'd given my sister at the age of 18 for a surprise birthday present an opera ticket. Why did I do that? We were very poor. We didn't go to operas, and I don't think she had a love of them. And I gave her a ticket to La Bohème, which is all about a tubercular woman dying, in love and dying. And I took off and went to Tuscany and saw this opera and was sickened actually by some of the misogyny in this work, but also some of the uncanny sort of foreshadowings. And I went off to Norway and I looked at a painting by Munch, because Munch painted his sister because she died of tuberculosis, and I thought about the ethics around it. What kind of a right did Munch have to paint this little sister again and again? What right did I have to describe the intimacies of my sisters and our family life now that she was dead?
I'm going to ask a bit more about that later, about that.
The ethics of it,
yes,
yeah.
but
So these were discoveries, and I felt emphatically that I didn't want one focus. I wanted to have a hybridity and to be relevant to lots of things and people.
Well, thank you very much, Arifa. We'll come back when we open it up. Francis, could I ask you to read next, as you're next alphabetically?
I'm just going to start at the beginning in hopes that it might tempt you to go a bit further at least. The suitcase arrived long after my father had left. It was handed to me 10 years ago in the car park of a London church on a miserable, gunmetal grey morning of rain and tears. The suitcase is chalk-coloured, weather-speckled, hooped with wooden struts that have warped. It smells of damp and the stale vapours of the past. It's fastened by 2 rusty lockable latches, but there are no keys, so it might have to be prized open. I haven't tried. It is very heavy, and I loaded it into my car with difficulty. My mother, who was with me that day, was unusually quiet as I drove home. She simply said, "If you open that suitcase, you'll never close it again." Now, while enjoying certain kinds of complication, such as seating mourners correctly at a funeral or insulting someone with a second-class stamp, my mother has a pronounced aversion to other complications: washing up, replacing a battery, packing or unpacking a suitcase. But I suspect her comment was directed at a larger possibility of difficulty than the merely practical. I didn't ask because I didn't want to talk about it. I put the suitcase in her attic, and then, some months later, my uncle agreed to take it to his house, where he put it in his attic. I didn't want it in my attic. I still don't. Not yet. The suitcase is too big and unwieldy to be the one that my father carried when he crossed the border out of his childhood and discovered just how sad a place the world can be. I don't know at what point in his life he acquired it. It just fetched up in an attic and became a convenient thing for putting things in, which is what a suitcase is. All I've been told is that it's crammed with paper, correspondence, documents, photographs, and that my stepmother didn't want to go through it. This, then, is my awkward inheritance, the remains of the confusions and scatterings of a life lived in dispersal. Until recently, I didn't think about the suitcase at all, but it then suddenly occurred to me that this has been a sort of effortful non-thinking, that for a long time I have been concentrating on forgetting it. Strangely, I've forgotten what it was that brought me to this realization. I only remember the lurching sensation that accompanied it, like being heaved up by a speed bump you haven't seen because you're fiddling with the car radio. Now, I find myself living inside the dilemma of 2 competing urges, wanting to know what's in the suitcase and wanting not to know. My hope is that if I open it, the suitcase may offer a way across a border to meet my father, who in life was unknowable to me. A gap in the wall, a hole in the wire will do. Then maybe I could restore something, what, from the dislocation. But I hesitate at the threshold of this journey. It fills me with misgivings. Know your limits. How often did I hear adults say this to me in my childhood, only ever delivered as an impeachment for some or other extramural behaviour? I've never appreciated being told to know my limits, but I've come to recognise, even if I don't easily accept, that borders are places of risk and we cross them at our peril. They are sacred, set apart, defined precisely by division, which is why we hold their defence to be sacrosanct. We teach ourselves the limit of our lives by beating the bounds, literally so in the past, today mostly symbolically, and often so habitually that we are not conscious of doing it. And here we stand, apart.
Thank you very much, Francis. Your father, towards the end of his life, developed Alzheimer's, as indeed did Arifa's, and but part of the point is that he was already this remote figure to you before he withdrew entirely, though obviously not voluntarily, into illness. And this really is the core of your book, that you're trying to, as it were, find your father and explain why your relationship with him wasn't as ideal as you might have liked it. When you set out to write the book, did you think that you would be able to resolve this puzzle of his personality and your relationship with him? Or did you simply hope that you would without any clear idea of how you would? In other words, did it happen during the writing?
You know, writing about my father was sort of like being mugged, because it's not something I was intending to do, and it's for the same reasons that you have said, that using the first person, making this into something that was about my family and my own feelings. But I had a sort of conjunction happened, and it must have come up from some sort of unconscious urge that I had been working quite a lot on refugees and questions to do with misplacement, displacement, relocation, dispersal, the whole politics and emotions of forced dispersal and having to leave your home. What is home? What does it mean? Can you ever go back to it? What are the borders that you have crossed? What are the borders that you're unable to cross? All of this, and I was thinking of that in terms of the ongoing crisis. So it's really cliche to call it a crisis. It's a catastrophe of contemporary refugee situations. And I sort of dodged it by, I did lots of things. I did an exhibition with a great photographer called Kaupo Kikas, and it was called What Would You Take? Because I was interested in, when you have to stand back from your possessions and you only have a very short time to leave your home, what do you take? And amazingly, or maybe not, nobody would rush that I spoke to and who in this exhibition said, I'd run back in and take the Rembrandt. I mean, sometimes it was the most humble of things. It was yogurt, the mother yogurt, or a bee smoker. So this whole idea of the kind of politics of possession and how enforced dispersal makes you stand back from what you have and who you are. And then I don't know, it really did. It took me by surprise. I was thinking, well, there's a suitcase. If I want to know what this is all about, there is a suitcase that belongs to my father, which has been in various attics, and I don't know in how many attics, as I say, but during his own life. I mean, he died more than 25 years ago. So I thought, well, maybe that could be the central metaphor, and so I started. But even then, I started, rather than sort of going in there and sort of opening it straight away, I just felt, let's find out about suitcases. And amazingly, there's no historian who's taken on a study of suitcases. And although it sounds maybe slightly banal and boring, it's actually a brilliant way of telling stories about people moving around and what you take and why you need it. And so I did lots of flippery-flappery around the edge of everything, and then it just kind of congealed into this. It seemed perverse not to link the two. And
so you had this interest in borders anyway, and then presumably at some point you suddenly thought, hold on a moment, my dad was always crossing borders because he had to flee from Bucharest in 1940 and then travelled, to Turkey, to Egypt, to South Africa, and then eventually here, and this whole idea of identity, that he was a British subject who never lived in Britain. So it was that way round that you suddenly realised that...
I mean, I'm fascinated by borders because they're everywhere. I mean, and as Gertrude Stein says, it's not, not everything can be about everything. So I had to kind of, take it sort of bit by bit. But I mean, we have skin, that's a border. We are born by a process of crossing borders. And so at the metaphysical and the emotional and the philosophical and geopolitically, all of these things have been fascinating to me for a long time. But I think I have, and it's grown as a result of writing this book, an absolute horror of national borders. Of the sort of toxic nationalism that tells you that you, who is on that side, belong that side, and you can't come this side. And I feel a sense of outrage, and I didn't know the extent of which my father had to be, chasing their tail in a way to get across borders before the borders shut behind them in this extraordinary sort of odyssey. Not so extraordinary, actually. I mean, the shock is that was the experience of millions of other people.
Yes, which you bring in as well.
But when you look at it with time having passed and still with these images of these huge, great big movements of people around the planet, you still think this can't be happening. This can't be an ordinary event. But it was.
Yes, and you say asking your father questions about his past was like being a border guard challenging him at a border.
Indeed. I mean, it goes back to what you were saying about kind of privacy, if you like, of the person that you remember, not just because they're dead, although that's also very significant. I mean, it seems to me a kind of, to a degree, a sort of selfish thing to try and bring people back, which is quite often the case that happens in this sort of genre of loss and mourning. I mean, it's like, don't give me grief. And it's, don't drag people back to face the fate for the second time of having to die again. So I was very interested in that literature too, and was very wary of crossing or being the equivalent of, US Garda boards who are absolutely terrifying.
Yes.
And saying, empty your pockets.
Yes. Thank you, Francis. I'm now going to ask Roy if you would read. You've got your own microphone, I think.
I think so.
I think just leave it on. It's probably all right. It should do. Yes.
Hello.
Is it on? It may not be on.
It's on now,
Yeah,
I think.
that's better.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm going to take just one of many, many images from a very early childhood. I think I was 3 when this happened. My father came home from Africa. The back kitchen door was left open so there'd be a bit of light for him down the passage when he came home on leave from Africa, my dad. Grandma set up a wail when she heard it. It's leave as does for 'em, she said, just like our Harry blown to bits on L60. Right after he'd been on leave, leaves are right, but it's when they go back. Mam frowns. No, mother, she says. Mother? She never says mother. That was in last war in trenches. It's not same now. Uncle Harry's monocle wasn't blown up. After that, it was Grandad's monocle. Grandad wasn't blown up. He went from trench to trench carrying water on his donkeys, and he never got a scratch. It was war as did for him just same, Grandma insists. Traipsing through mud with them damn donkeys. Gentle creatures, Lizzie, Grandad used to say. Gentle be damned, Grandma said. That's nonsense, Mother, Mam says. He lived for years after that, you know he did. It was pneumonia on them building sites. He's gone. That's all I know, Grandma says. And now the monocle's in the sewing machine drawer with all the buttons. It's waiting there for an eye. I've tied a ribbon to it, so it's mine. Auntie Kitty sighs over her knitting. She creeps up over the grate, does Auntie Kitty. She likes the fire. Grandma shakes out her specs, rocks in her rocker, flops her book open. Mam hangs on the mantelpiece and stares down into the fire. She's lost in thought. I heard Auntie Mary say that once, lost in thought. And I wonder about the lostness and the thought. And now I understand. I see it's the firelight where the thought gets lost, lost in the flickering. I'm scared she'll not find her way back. Waiting, the ticking clock, the sudden spurt of brightness from the dying fire. Mam kicks the coal, lightens our darkness now and then. What worries me is what am I going to say? Don't say now till you're sure it's him, Eric says. Then ask if he had a nice journey. But that's not it. It's not the right thing. I wish somebody would tell me what it is. I'm waiting under Grandma's rocker, watching the crack of blackness at the door. Nobody else sees the Air Force cap come through the crack and wave up and down. Just a cap, a blue cap with a badge waving up and down. No hand, not even fingers. I watch it, think about it, wonder what to say. It's just a cap. Nothing special about a cap. How long will it go on if I say nothing? Will it go away? It's my dad, I suppose, outside. Nobody knows but me. Mum, I say, I think somebody wants to come in. Then dizzy, flung up into the air. How's he been, Dad says. His fingers always rolling cigarettes. His bony elbows sticking through his khaki jumper. Fretting, Mum says, you know. She gives him a knowing look, quick, then down again into the fire, kicking the flames to make the coal fall. They stand like that, not looking at each other, one at each end of the mantelpiece as though nothing's changed. What's missing now? Dad's home. Dad's home from the war, but I don't understand. Next morning I see him in bed and I creep down into the cold kitchen. There's a train set laid out on the floor. Wasn't there last night? I sit in Grandma's rocker and watch it from a distance, wondering whose it is.
Thank you very much, Roy. That reading gives a very clear flavour of your book, its tone, its conjuring of atmosphere, its principal characters, and the child's not wholly comprehending viewpoint. It's a comparatively sustained passage compared to much of the book, which is sort of made up of vivid fragments. And unlike the other two shortlisted books, it's immediately there rather than retrospective. Could you say something about the origins of this book? Because I know it was a long gestation period.
Yes. Well, I was writing a lot about my family because I was living in America, doing a degree in creative writing. And I had an idea that I've been writing mostly short stories, and I needed to finish off for my thesis by doing something a bit longer, perhaps a short novel. And that was where it began. I was going to write a short novel about life on the Lancashire coast, where pretty much everybody makes a living either in fishing or in shrimping. And that was my ancestors in my mother's family were doing that all the time. And especially my grandmother, who, I sense, if there is a central character in my book, it's my grandmother. So I started writing, and I was using her memories, not my own. I was going from stories she'd told me. But most of those stories she'd told me when I was, let's say, under 12. And so I was submerged in that world. And then one night I had this I've described this many times, and I've also added it to my book because I put a little essay at the end called Writing Simple Annals, and that's an afterword to the book. So I tell the story out, so I'll sort of simplify it here if I could. I used to keep a piece of paper rolled in my typewriter in case I should wake up with an idea, and I didn't want to forget it by the morning, you know. And one morning I actually did wake up, and gosh, there was something on the piece of paper. I don't remember waking up, I don't remember getting out of bed, typing anything, and going back to bed. I don't remember a thing. But when I whipped this paper out and read it, it wasn't really making any sense. It was all about flames, fire, explosions. I thought maybe it's about Guy Fawkes Night, something like that. But as the day went on, gradually, I realized it was a real memory of a bombing attack on a train that I was traveling in with my mother, going to meet my father for the first time. That was the real beginning. Because after that, I decided to dispense with the novel idea altogether and just wait for these moments. And I didn't care how long a time there was between them. I wasn't deliberately hunting them down. telling myself I've got to remember one for tomorrow, I've got a day off, you know. Nothing. I just waited and waited and waited. And that's why, as Peter says, it took me so long to write it, because sometimes months, and I hate to say it, but even years went by when I did nothing. I just waited for the material to seize me, to seize my imagination, and it's still happening. I don't think this book will actually ever be finished.
Well, that was going to be my next question, Roy, because the book is unusual in that it only deals with your childhood up to the eve of your 11th birthday, and it's not, as I said earlier, viewed retrospectively, looking down a long tunnel at your former self. And I can think of a few other books that we've ever had for the prize that took a similar approach, perhaps Alan Garner's book, Where Shall We Run To? But were you tempted, or indeed are you tempted, to continue the story, or do you agree with J.M. Barrie, who once declared nothing that happens after we were 12 matters very much?
I feel like that as well, very much so. I think I might be continuing it all the time. I think I have written quite a few good bits for it since Charles published it for me. But I don't know if somebody will kindly do a bigger edition one day. If so, that would be lovely. But I have written quite a few more bits, which I'd never remembered before. They've been new, they've just arrived, and some of them quite fascinating. So I think it may happen that. Will I write anything else is the other thing, but I've always written short stories, but I don't actually think they're as interesting as this.
Right, well, thank you very much. We are up against the clock, and actually what I'm going to do is see if there are any questions from the audience, because I have this very tight schedule that says by now I should be asking questions to the audience. If not, I have other questions I can ask, but if we've got any questions, please put up your hand and wait till we will bring you a microphone. Well, that's either I assume that's a very satisfied audience. It will come back to it. I wanted to ask you about the idea of writing about yourselves, which after all is what memoir is. And I wanted to know, do you have a sense that the selves that you are writing about in your books are different from the person doing the writing? And do you feel you need to keep a distance between your present self and the person you're writing about, or do you think it's important not to keep that distance? I'll go in alphabetical order again. So, Arifa.
I didn't think it through as consciously as that. You know, this was my inquiry into what happened, and and that took in, family beginnings, migration, the trauma of that, the culture, the cultural aspects of all of that, of leaving home, some of what you were saying. The suitcase was just such a sorry, that's not your question, but the suitcase was such a significant item in my home, and it still is, because I think migrants store things away in suitcases, and my mother still does that, and there are tons of suitcases in her home. And I think it's a real legacy of having come with the suitcase. It's extremely significant part of our family. So I was inquiring into, who was my sister, and who was I to her, who was she to me? I was using my voice. There was absolutely no separation of self, my written self and me here sitting talking. So my inquiries were really, I wanted as much transparency. That's not to say objectivity or truth, because what I felt I had to do was, well, first of all, seek permission from those people whose lives I was going to describe and expose to some degree on paper, and there's ethics around that. And people, part of my mother was very suspicious. My brother was too. And I've made him a shadow in the book, because I didn't even have to ask him. I knew he was too private to want himself as a character in my book. And we all have versions of of what we think is our family story, and it's very important, I think, to remember their versions. And I problematized that. I sort of made it made my version an unreliable version by being truthful in some of my ropier memories, in some of the, the way that the more you think, the more vivid and quite surprising memories come at you. You remember things that clash with your narrative of what happened.
Yes.
So there's quite a lot going on there, and I tried to put all of that uncertainty and unreliability on the page. Ethically, I'm getting ahead of you, aren't I?
You are. That's fine.
I felt that I had to ask certain permissions. But I also had to make clear to myself as well and to others that this was my story, this was my version of events. And by the end of this book, I did wonder whether it was about me or whether it was about my sister.
Yes. Well, the fact I was going to ask that because it's called subtitle "A Sister's Story," and of course that could mean it's your story as a sister, or it's your sister's own story. And I thought that I like that sort of equivocal, which I think is in the book as well. Yes. Francis, you're slightly less, because your presence in the book is almost your present self in a way. You do look back to your childhood, and I mean there are extraordinary coincidences when you read a lot of these books that both of you as children, perhaps it's something that children did, that you both kept little treasures in boxes, and they both got lost. I was astonished when rereading the books, thinking, oh my goodness, it happened to both of them. So what I was actually saying, there is a bit, there is a sense of yourself as a child, particularly in this instance where it goes missing in a move rather than having your sister steal it. So if you'd like to say something about your two selves.
As I was saying earlier, I was very guarded about putting too much of myself into this, but it's something. What fascinated me was this learning a bit about the border between the unconscious or the subconscious and the conscious, and I'd never sort of reflected on my dreams with any serious, labour ever before. In fact, I thought it was sort of ridiculous. I remember there's a story of somebody, writing with his wife's lipstick on a mirror in the middle of the night. He was sure he'd completely sort of solved the mysteries of life and the universe, and next morning when he looked at it, it said it's all to do with demi-quavers or something like that. So, but actually I found that this border that we have, that's how I think of it, is a porous border. It needs to be. But if you punch too big a hole in it, your subconscious can overwhelm your conscious life, and that's where dreams became more and more vivid and to a degree threatening, not necessarily in their content, but this idea that there was all this stuff happening that I was, to another part of me, and just an awareness that, I had to kind of respect that border and not go into just sort of the unconscious. But I think that's where all these experiences from childhood and stuff do sort of surface, bob up to the surface. So I felt very the need to defend myself.
Yes.
And I think when you're involved in a sort of some kind of relationship with the dead. I mean, the Greeks had that word nekoia, and hence necropolis. But the dead, unleashed, can become very lively and very rowdy and ask you to do things for them. And I felt the need not to get sort of too chained to this transmission, if you like. And it's also, I would think, the end of it. I think it's that we perhaps intrude too much.
Yes.
Ourselves, and it's us who are sort of dragging them to the surface, and that needs to be very considered and can be a dangerous thing. And so I think, yes, I felt and still feel a degree of self-protection in this whole sort of adventure.
Yes. Roy, you're obviously looking back at a much more distant self, and do you, when you were writing the book, did you feel this is me, or did you think this is me in a different world at a different time? And could you look at your earlier self objectively, or because of the way the book evolved, were you so close to it that you didn't see any distance between yourself and the child you once were?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, because I think both of those things could possibly have happened at different times. But in general, I felt, when I was writing, I was totally immersed in what I had been. I mean, the two parts, it's in two parts, isn't it? And in the second part, I'm a bit older, we've moved house, and I'm a little bit more savvy. And my interests have changed quite a bit because sex begins to creep in. But in the early part, I was literally recreating myself at a very early age. And alcohol played a big part in that.
In the recreation, or not your childhood, I hope?
Not my childhood at all, but after a night of writing, I used to write all night. And this is when my wife had gone back to the States where her family was, and so I was by myself for a while. And I would wake up, having done some good work and really, really good writing, to find myself, my feet intertwined with the back of the chair and the rest of me on the floor, flat, having been asleep until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I woke up, went to do my teaching. I had a little teaching job. Back home, about 9 o'clock, started again. And I was just going back into that.
Mm.
And I sometimes, when there were other people, other children especially, I could hear the things they were saying to me outside. And I had a little flat in a Parisian, chambre de bonne. And I could hear the voices in the corridors. And I remember, I used to answer them sometimes. "Shut up, Tucker!" He was a kid I hated. So it was very different.
Yes. I'm going to try again for a question. We've got time for about one question, because if there aren't any questions, we have to fit in a few more things this evening. This is a bumper evening, partly because it is the 40th anniversary. So for the moment, I would like to thank my shortlisted authors, our shortlisted authors, for taking part in this, and thank you very much indeed. Yes, if you'd like to be making your way back to your chairs, and while you're doing that, I just need to say something about the history of the prize. I've been asked to outline 40 years in about 5 seconds. So the prize was originally known as the J.R. Ackerley Prize, and actually, I'm not sure how many people know this, it didn't become the PEN Ackerley Prize until 2006. We'd had a long association with English PEN, and to cement that and make it a closer relationship, it became the PEN Ackerley in the same way American PEN has the PEN Faulkner and the PEN Hemingway Prize. The idea for it came from one of our former judges, Colin Spencer, and it was he who suggested it to Ackerley's sister, that she might like to endow a literary prize in her brother's memory. He died in 1967. She did this, and that meant that all future income from Ackerley's books, whether it's foreign rights, film rights, or royalties, go to fund this prize, and apart from a small amount invested, that's what funds this prize, which probably explains why our winner's cheque is not as large as I'd like it to be. She appointed Colin Spencer, the novelist Francis King, who was Ackerley's literary executor, the biographer Michael Holroyd, and Neville Braybrook, who'd produced a wonderful volume of Ackerley's letters, to be the trustees and judges of this prize, but she left it entirely up to them what sort of prize it would be. Now, given that Ackerley, everything he wrote was autobiographical, from his pioneering homosexual 1925 play, The Prisoners of War, to his equally scandalous 1968 memoir, My Father and Myself, given these were all autobiographical, it seems sensible that that would be the prize. So when Nancy died in 1979, they set up the prize, and it was first awarded in 1982 to Edward Blishen for his book Shaky Relations. I think a title that might apply to quite a lot of the books we've read as judges. when people are writing about their families. Since then, the prize has been awarded to seasoned writers like Blishen, some of them extremely well known, as well as those who are making their literary debuts, which is one of the nice things about the prize. You get a mixture of completely unknowns and very well-known authors. There is a glittering roster of names who've won this prize: Anthony Burgess, Dan Jacobson, Margaret Forster, Germaine Greer, Alan Bennett, Richard Cobb, Michael Frayn, Blake Morrison, Diana Athill, John Osborne, Barry Humphries, Julia Blackburn, Lorna Sage, Jenny Diski, Brian McGee and Miranda Seamer. But there have also been people who won the prize as their very first and sometimes their only book. And these have been equally interesting. Among them are John Healy, Catherine Deus, Catherine Fitzherbert, Gabriel Weston, Sonali Durrani-Agala, Amy Liptrot, and Yrsa Daley-Ward. John Healy's The Glass Arena was quite an early winner. It won in 1989, and it described his life as a down and out who ended up in jail, but while in jail learned to become almost a chess grandmaster. It became and is now considered an English classic and was made into a film starring Mark Rylance. But the only other book Healy has ever written since then is a specialist one about playing chess. By contrast, Kathleen Deus, beg her pardon, who was a joint winner in 1983, the only time there has been a joint winner, she was encouraged to go on to write 4 more volumes of autobiography about her extremely hard life in working class Birmingham, and these were subsequently published in an omnibus edition by Virago. I was co-opted as a judge and trustee a couple of years after I'd written a biography of J.R. Ackerley in 18... I seem to be stuck in the 19th century. In 1989, I'm beginning to feel it. This was, I was warned, a job for life. And this was further emphasised when Francis King appointed me his successor, both as chair of the judges and as Ackerley's literary executor. These are handcuffs which, though not exactly golden, have nevertheless been an honour to wear. When announcing that he wished to retire as chair, Francis characteristically described the job to me as, for the most part, a tedious, draining and ungrateful one. But I'm happy to report this has not been my experience. By special dispensation, we do very occasionally allow judges to retire if they've got a very good reason to, though both Neville Braybrook and Francis King died in harness. Michael Holroyd retired in order to write, as he put it, one last book, but I'm glad to say that since then he's actually produced 3. We didn't call him back. The historian and biographer Richard Davenport Hines, who succeeded Francis, served for several years, but then he retired when he relocated to France. I think the best excuse to get out of judging I've ever heard. And Colin Spencer retired in 2020 at the age of 87, having served as a judge right from the beginning in 1982. And I think this means he must hold some kind of record for reading memoirs and autobiographies at a rate of between about 25 and 45 a year. I'd like to thank all the judges, past and present, for their diligence, their acumen, their strong opinions, and on the whole, their good temper during our many long discussions, and long may the prize continue. When Duncan Fallowell won the prize in 2012 with How to Disappear, which was published by the tiny Ditto Press, described by Duncan as 3 boys in a basement in Bethnal Green, he described the event at which he was awarded the prize as the best night of my professional life. But not everyone has had the opportunity to enjoy receiving the prize in front of a live audience. Our 2 most recent winners, Alison Light and Claire Wilcox, were awarded the prize during lockdown. Alison for A Radical Romance in 2020 and Claire with Patchwork in 2021. And this meant they did not take place in a live event. But I'm glad to say they're both with us now, and I'd like to call them up on, not a stage, but come to stand with me. These are outstanding books, and they are for sale, I'm glad to say there. If you could both come up. And thank you. Very well deserved. I'm going to ask Claire to say a few words as our most recent winner about what winning the prize meant to her. And then I'm going to ask Alison to announce the winner and hand over the cheque. So, Claire.
Well, as you know, when you awarded me the prize last year, I nearly fainted with shock.
Online.
Online. I was all on my own.
We
as
did
well.
edit it a bit.
Yes. I never imagined in a million years being shortlisted, let alone winning. It's had a huge impact. It's made me rethink everything I do and I plan to do. And I suppose I'm quite a good example of somebody who does things late. I'm always late to have children, late to get a job, and very late to write my first book. But writing it, I was thinking, what took me so long? I'd always wanted to write, I'd always read avidly, but I was pressing my nose against the window of places like the London Library thinking, how do you get in there? How do you write? What do you write about? And then I realised that all the things that I felt as sort of not exactly impeded me, but consumed me, which was care of duty to family, those I love and lost, care of duty to objects in the museum, where I've worked for the last 30 years at the V&A, looking after things. Those objects and those people and those memories and the interweaving of memories into fabric, which obsesses and fascinates me, those are my source material. That was where I should be going. So in a moment of revelation, really, a little bit like, waking up in the night thinking, that's not the block, that's the solution. And so I embarked on this project, which took 5 years, and gradually the stack of paper grew higher and higher. And then suddenly last year in the pandemic, I won this prize, and I was just astounded and moved and very honoured, especially as it was awarded by writers. And at last I'm in the room with writers. It's wonderful. I'm really excited about the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. As I think you'll have heard from our speakers this evening, we're very proud of this shortlist of 3 very different but absolutely absorbing and brilliant books. It is a privilege to judge this prize. We sometimes, when we call in books that we suddenly realise we shouldn't have done, some dreary memoir by, say, a politician, though we tend to avoid those, but we also discover, as it were, writers that we didn't know about. And it is a great privilege, and I wish we could just give everyone the prize, but inevitably there has to be a winner. I do recommend that you buy. All these books are for sale. Not only our 3 shortlisted winners, these are brilliant books, but Alison's book and Claire's book also for sale. I'm going to ask Alison to announce the winner and present the cheque, and then I'll just do my closing remarks, which won't take very long at all. Alison.
Thank you. Yes, and you'll be relieved to know that I don't have a prepared speech. I'm simply been elevated to the person who gets to read out the announcement, which is delightful, great pleasure to be able to do. And listening to all 3 authors speak, I'm sure that, as with many people in the room, I felt very inspired, which I think is the main thing. There are a lot of young writers here too. It made me want to go and do more work, and I think that's what we want, is to feel both moved and excited and inspired by you. So thank you very much, all 3 of you. And the winner of the PEN Ackerley Prize for 2022 is Frances Stonor Saunders for The Suitcase.
Would you like to say a few words, Frances?
I'm shaking, actually. I'm overwhelmed, and I feel so honoured that you've chosen this book, and so honoured to have been in the company of these wonderful writers here who were also shortlisted. And it's a great encouragement. It's a huge amount of money, and after ploughing a very solitary furrow, which is my experience of writing, but then with a double wham of COVID, I feel that I'm back in a fold, not the fold, but a fold of people who are so generous and in doing these prizes with all the work that it involves and thinking so carefully about the books. It's a huge compliment, and I feel very humbled and very honoured and massively, massively grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. I'm slightly stunned. I have nothing else to say.
Thank you. I'd just like to end by doing some thanks. I'd like to thank Claire and Alison and our 3 shortlisted winners, shortlisted authors. I mean, I think, you know, what has been said this evening, we didn't pay anyone to say it, shows why this prize is important. It's a small prize in all sorts of ways, but it does open doors, and I think it's something that I'm really pleased to be involved in. I'd also like to thank Marion Rankin, Zoe Sadler and Sim Eldham at English PEN, who have been working for months organising not only this event but press releases and all the rest of it. Claire Berliner at the London Library, thank you Claire for hosting this, for sorting out the IT and all this stuff. See, I can't even say IT, it's wrong, isn't it? Audio, whatever it is. I'd like to thank the prizes administrator, Gilly Vincent, who, for very little money, negotiates with publishers. That's something I think to be avoided on the whole. In order to get the books out of them, often you would think they were being asked to give them to an orphanage rather than to be submitted for a prize. And I'd like to thank the Ackerley Trust financial advisor, Simon Lunn, who makes sure that our accounts are in order. And lastly, I'd like to thank Naman Chaudhry, who not only produced the promotional video for this evening's event for the social media, but also created the J.R. Ackerley website, www.jrackerley.com. This is a website where, if you've been inspired by what you've heard this evening, you will find an outline of Ackerley's life, you'll find a list of his works, details of film and stage and television adaptations of his books, galleries of photographs, a page indeed about the PEN Ackerley Prize, and another page about his half-sister Diana Peter, who wrote a memoir called The Secret Orchard of Roger Ackerley, which is like a diptych with Ackerley's own, my father and myself, telling the story from the other family's point of view. And Diana bequeathed all the income from her books when she died to help fund the Ackerley Prize. So thank you all for being here. And this is just to remind you that all the books we discussed this evening are on sale, and the previous winners' books are on sale. Please buy them, please read them, and share some of the pleasure that we've had in doing that. Thank you very much. Well done, thank you.